The air inside the dungeon was thick with moisture, the scent of ancient stone and decay filling the nostrils of the adventurers as they pressed forward through the winding corridors. Torches flickered, casting long shadows against the walls, and the occasional drip of water echoed eerily through the space. The party moved cautiously, weapons drawn, eyes darting to every dark crevice where danger could lurk. They had heard the stories. This dungeon was old, far older than any known ruin, and whispered rumors spoke of something deep within, something that defied all logic. The Aorc warrior led the way, his massive frame tense, a hand resting on the hilt of his war axe. Behind him, the elven mage clutched her staff, fingers glowing with faint magical energy, ready to unleash a spell at a moment's notice. The rogue, ever silent, flitted between shadows, his keen eyes scanning for traps. The cleric, at the rear, muttered quiet prayers to his deity, his face pale with an unshakable sense of dread. As they ventured deeper, the passageways became more unnatural. Strange carvings lined the walls, depicting battles long forgotten, figures that seemed almost familiar, yet different, locked in combat against monstrous foes. The air grew heavier, charged with something beyond magic, an energy that sent an involuntary shiver down the spines of even the bravest among them. Then, as they turned a final corner, they saw it. A massive stone door, its surface cracked with age, stood at the end of the corridor. And like the other doors in the dungeon, this one was not marked with sigils of protection or warnings of great peril. Instead, it bore a single emblem, a circular crest with an unfamiliar symbol etched into the center. It was crude, simple even, but it carried a weight of significance that none of them could explain. The elf stepped forward, running her fingers across the emblem, trying to decipher its meaning. This isn't like the others, she murmured. It doesn't feel like magic. It feels different. The Aorc exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the door. Only one way to find out. With a grunt of effort, he shoved against the heavy stone, and with a deep, grinding noise it began to move. A gust of stale air rushed past them as the entrance creaked open, revealing a chamber shrouded in darkness. The torchlight barely penetrated the ward beyond, but as they stepped forward, the glow of something else flickered in the gloom. A faint, blue luminescence emanated from bioluminescent fungi along the walls, casting an eerie light over the space. Chains hung from the ceiling, old and rusted, some broken, others still intact. And there, in the center of the room, bound by thick iron shackles, lay the impossible. A man. A human. The adventurers froze, their breaths stolen by the sight. Humans were a myth, a relic of a past so distant that not even the eldest of elves could recall their existence. They had vanished from history, wiped away by time itself. And yet, here he was, very much real, very much alive. His body was covered in grime, his clothing tattered and worn beyond recognition. Scars marred his skin, old wounds and fresh alike, but it was not just his condition that unseated them. It was the sheer presence he exuded. Even unconscious, bound, and weakened, there was something about him that made the Aorc, a warrior who had stood against countless foes, take an instinctive step back. The rogue was the first to recover, stepping cautiously closer, his voice low. How is this possible? He knelt beside the human, pressing 2 fingers to his neck. A pulse. Steady, strong. The human stirred slightly, a faint groan escaping his lips, as if the mere act of being touched had begun to rouse him from his slumber. The elf hesitated, her mind racing. Magic could preserve bodies for centuries, but this was not stasis. This was not some elaborate illusion. He was alive, breathing, real. We should leave him, the cleric whispered, voice tight with fear. This is unnatural. He shouldn't exist. The Aorc, however, remained silent, his gaze locked on the human's face. There was something familiar about it, something buried deep in the primal instincts of warriors throughout the ages. A threat, a promise, a challenge. He had fought many great foes in his time, but never had he felt this kind of unease, not even in the presence of demons or dragons. Slowly, cautiously, he reached down and grasped one of the rusted chains, testing its strength. With a sharp pull, the iron links snapped, brittle with age. At that moment, the human's eyes shot open. A collective gasp filled the chamber as the adventurers took an involuntary step back. The human's gaze was unlike anything they had ever seen. His eyes burned, not with magic, not with fury, but with something deeper, something olden. Instinct, knowledge, the understanding of war, of struggle, of survival in its purest form. He inhaled sharply, his breath ragged, and then, with the creaking of muscles, he sat up. His gaze swept over them, assessing, calculating, as if he were the one who had discovered them and not the other way around. Silence hung thick in the chamber, the weight of 1,000 unspoken questions pressing down on the group. Then, at last, the human spoke. His voice was hoarse, rough from disuse, but his words were clear. "Where am I?" The Aorc found his voice first, his grip tightening on his weapon, not in hostility, but in readiness. "You're in a dungeon. We found you here." The human's brow furrowed slightly, as if processing the information. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he stood. Despite his weakened state, there was no mistaking the raw strength in his frame. He rolled his shoulders, stretching, testing his limbs, as though waking from a long sleep. He glanced at the broken chain still dangling from his wrist, then at the adventurers before him. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his gaze before he finally spoke again. The chamber remained deathly silent as the adventurers stood before the newly awakened human, their minds struggling to process the impossible. The glow of bioluminescent fungi cast eerie shadows across the room, their flickering light barely illuminating the man who had been shackled in this forsaken dungeon. His gaze shifted between them, sharp and assessing, his muscles tensing with the subtle alertness of a warrior who had been thrust into unfamiliar territory. The Aorc, ever the first to act, took a step forward, towering over the human, his grip tightening on the heft of his axe. "You didn't answer my question," the human said, his voice hoarse from disuse but carrying a weight that sent an unconscious shiver through the group. "How long have I been gone?" The elf hesitated, then carefully traced the ancient symbols on the chamber walls, murmuring incantations under her breath. She turned to the others, her expression grim. "This place is older than any record I know. The magic here, it doesn't match anything in our libraries. If he was sealed here, it could have been centuries." The rogue scoffed, though there was little amusement in his voice. "Centuries? No human could survive that long. Even magic can't sustain a mortal body indefinitely." But the cleric, still standing near the threshold of the room as though afraid to step closer, shook his head. "Not unless something kept him alive. Something powerful." The human exhaled slowly, taking in their words. He looked down at his wrists, at the rusted remnants of his bindings, then to the walls lined with beta carvings. His fingers brushed over the deep scars on his skin, as if trying to remember how they had come to be. "I remember a war," he murmured, half to himself. "I remember fighting, but against who?" He turned to them suddenly, his gaze piercing. "Tell me, what do you know of my people?" The adventurers exchanged uneasy glances. The answer was obvious, but saying it aloud felt almost blasphemous. It was the Aorc who finally spoke, his voice low and hesitant. "Humans are myths." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. "They existed long ago, but they disappeared. No records tell us how or why. Some say they were wiped out. Some say they simply faded into legend." The human's jaw tightened, and for a brief moment, an emotion flickered across his face. Grief, perhaps, or frustration. "Gone," he muttered under his breath. "All of them." The elf hesitated before speaking again. "If any remained, they have long since vanished from the world. There are no human cities, no human empires, no remnants of their kind. Until now, we thought they were just stories." The silence stretched between them, heavy with uncertainty. Then, without warning, the human took a step forward, and despite his weakened state, the sheer presence he carried was enough to make the rogue instinctively reach for his daggers. The Aorc held his ground, but even he seemed wary. "And what of the world?" the human asked. "Who rules it now?" "The Dominion," the cleric said quietly, his fingers gripping the holy symbol around his neck. "They rose long ago, conquering the old kingdoms. Most of us live under their rule, or in the fringes where their influence is weaker. They control everything." The human frowned. "The Dominion," he repeated, as if the word itself was foreign to him. "And you serve them?" That question seemed to strike a nerve, and the adventurers stiffened. "We don't serve them," the rogue muttered. "We survive. That's all anyone can do." The human studied them for a moment, then nodded as if piecing together a puzzle. He took another slow, measured breath, then looked down at his own hands, clenching and unclenching his fists. "I don't remember everything," he admitted, his voice steady despite the weight of the revelation. "But I remember this: humanity does not simply disappear. We do not fade into legend." His gaze lifted once more, and in that instant, there was something in his eyes, something dangerous. "We fight." The Aorc let out a slow breath, watching him with newfound wariness. The elf stepped closer, her curiosity outweighing her fear. "If what you say is true, if you are the last of your kind, what will you do now?" The human was quiet for a moment, as if truly considering the question. Then, with deliberate purpose, he reached down and picked up one of the broken chains that had once bound him. He held it in his grip, feeling the weight of it, the rusted metal cold against his palm. His expression hardened. "I will find out what happened," he said. "And if the world has forgotten humanity," his fingers tightened around the chain until the metal groaned under the pressure, "then I will remind them." The words sent a chill through the adventurers. The Aorc, who had always known war, saw something in the human that unseated him, a force of will unlike anything he had encountered before. The elf, her mind filled with history and magic, realized that they were standing in the presence of something ancient, something the world had buried long ago. The rogue, for all his cynicism, found himself staring at the human with a mixture of disbelief and grudging respect. The cleric, however, whispered a quiet prayer, uncertain whether this discovery was a blessing or a curse. The dungeon around them seemed to hum with an unseen energy, as if it, too, had been waiting for this moment. The weight of forgotten history pressed down upon them all, but none more so than the man who had just awoken from a slumber spanning centuries. He had been sealed away, abandoned by time itself, but now he stood once more, and the world would soon know that humanity had not been erased. The cold wind howled through the ruins of the old fortress, its crumbling walls standing as the last remnants of an age long past. The adventurers moved cautiously through the overgrown stone corridors, their footsteps muffled by the thick moss and scattered debris. At the front of the group, the human strode forward with a purpose that none of them could quite understand. Though he had only been freed from the dungeon days ago, he moved as if he had spent his entire life preparing for this moment. His eyes scanned the ruins with the intensity of someone piecing together fragments of a dream. The elf, keeping peace beside him, finally spoke. "This place, you recognize it, don't you?" The human stopped, staring at the worn stone archway ahead of them. His fingers brushed over the ancient carvings, barely visible beneath layers of time and decay. "I do," he said, his voice heavy with something unreadable. "Or at least, I think I do." The Aorc glanced around warily, gripping the handle of his axe. "This place is cursed," he muttered. "No one comes here and leaves untouched." The rogue, ever skeptical, scoffed. "Superstition. It's abandoned. Nothing but ghosts of the past." The human let out a humorless chuckle. "You'd be surprised," he murmured, his fingers tracing the patterns in the stone. The elf watched him closely. "You remember something, don't you?" The human exhaled slowly. "Not fully. But this place, his eyes darkened as he turned to face them. This was a stronghold, Vance. Not just any stronghold. It belonged to my people. The cleric, who had remained mostly silent, tightened his grip on his holy symbol. A human fortress, he asked cautiously. Impossible. The records say nothing about this place. The human gave him a knowing look. Then your records are incomplete. The air grew still, the weight of forgotten history settling around them like an unseen force. The rogue kicked at a loose stone. If this was some great fortress, where's the proof? He gestured at the crumbling walls, the collapsed towers. Looks like any other ruin. The human said nothing at first. Instead, he moved forward, stepping through the archway into what remained of the main hall. The adventurers hesitated before following, their unease growing with every step. The chamber was vast, its ceiling long since caved in, allowing shafts of pale light to filter through the overgrown remains of the structure. Stone banners, faded and torn, still clung to the walls. Symbols none of them recognized were carved into the pillars, their meaning long lost to time. But the human knew. He walked among the ruins as if he could see them as they once were. His hand brushed against a fallen shield, its emblem barely visible beneath layers of dust and corrosion. He knelt, tracing the design with his fingertips. I've been here before, he murmured. The elf stepped closer, her curiosity overcoming her caution. Are you certain? He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. I remember standing in this hall. I remember voices, warriors gathering. This place was alive, Vance. It was ours. The Aorc frowned. If this was a human stronghold, what happened to it? The human's gaze darkened. The Dominion happened. Silence fell over the group. They had all grown up under the Dominion's rule, knowing it as the unshakable force that governed the world. The idea that humans had once stood against it, that they had built fortresses like this in defiance, was almost too much to believe. The cleric hesitated before speaking. If the Dominion destroyed this place, then there's nothing left for us here. We should go before we attract unwanted attention. The human didn't move. He reached down, gripping the rusted hilt of a sword that lay beneath stone and earth. Lifting it, he examined the worn blade, its edge dulled by time but its craftsmanship undeniable. They tried to erase us, he said quietly. But we were here. We stood. We fought. His fingers tightened around the hilt. And I think we left something behind. The rogue crossed his arms. What exactly are you looking for? The human looked past him, toward the far end of the hall where a broken staircase led downward into darkness. Answers. Without another word, he strode forward, descending into the depths of the fortress ruins. The others exchanged uncertain glances before following. The air grew colder as they moved deeper, the scent of damp stone and ancient dust surrounding them. The elf conjured a small orb of light, illuminating the passage ahead. The walls were lined with murals, their details faded but still visible. They depicted battles, warriors standing against monstrous enemies, banners raised high. And among them, humans. The cleric swallowed hard. This isn't possible. The Aorc exhaled through his nose. And yet here it is. The human moved ahead, his gaze locked on the end of the corridor where a massive door of black stone stood, untouched by time. Symbols covered its surface, glowing faintly as he approached. He placed a hand on the stone, feeling a familiar energy pulse beneath his fingertips. Then, as if responding to his presence, the door shuddered, ancient mechanisms groaning to life. The adventurers stepped back as dust and debris fell from the ceiling. The rogue cursed under his breath. You're opening it? What if something's behind there? The human didn't answer. The door slowly swung inward, revealing a chamber untouched by the decay of time. A grand hall lined with weapons, armor, and banners that had not faded. At the center, a massive throne sat, empty, waiting. And on the walls, more murals, vans that told the final story of humanity's war against the Dominion. The human stepped inside, his breath unsteady. We didn't disappear, he murmured. We were betrayed. The others hesitated, absorbing the weight of his words. The rogue whistled low. Well, he said, looks like your people left more than just ruins. The human turned, his eyes burning with new determination. They left a legacy. He reached up, taking an old better standard from the wall. Though worn, its symbol was still clear, the mark of the lost human armies. He gripped it tightly, then turned to the others. And it's time the world remembered. The chamber was deathly silent, save for the faint hum of energy pulsing through the ancient walls. The human stood at the center of the forgotten throne room, his fingers brushing against the banner in his hands. It was a relic of a time erased from history, a symbol of defiance that had survived the Dominion's wrath. Behind him, the adventurers hesitated at the threshold, their eyes darting between the grand murals and the eerie glow emanating from the ancient artifacts lining the walls. The elf was the first to step forward, her voice hushed with reverence. This place it's untouched, preserved. The rogue whistled low, crossing his arms. Which means either something is keeping it that way, or we're the first idiots to step foot in here in a long time. The Aorc let out a low grunt, shifting his grip on his axe. Feels like a tomb. The human turned, his expression unreadable. Not a tomb, he corrected. A warning. He strode toward the far end of the hall, where the grand throne loomed over the chamber. It was massive, carved from dark stone, etched with sigils that flickered faintly as he approached. It was empty, abandoned for centuries, yet it still radiated an undeniable presence. His fingers traced the armrest, feeling grooves worn into the stone by hands long since turned to dust. Memories, fragmented and elusive, tugged at the edges of his mind. Flashes of warriors standing before this throne, pledging themselves to a cause now forgotten. He exhaled sharply. This was the heart of the resistance, he murmured. The cleric adjusted the grip on his holy symbol, eyes darting warily across the murals that lined the walls. The Dominion erased all records of human civilization, he said carefully. If this place survived, there must be a reason why. The human turned to face him. Because they never found it. He gestured at the murals, massive depictions of battles waged against the Dominion, of soldiers standing defiant even as their cities burned. But there was something else, something more disturbing. The final mural was different. The Dominion was not the only enemy. There, in the shadows of battle, were figures of human shape but twisted, standing beside the enemy. The elf's breath caught. Betrayal. The word hung heavy in the air. The rogue scoffed. That explains why they lost. But the human's jaw clenched as he studied the image. They didn't just lose. His voice was grim. They were sold out. His fingers curled into a fist. The truth settled upon him like a crushing weight. The Dominion had not defeated humanity through sheer force alone. Someone, perhaps many, had turned against their own kind. The cleric swallowed hard. This changes everything. Before anyone could respond, the room trembled. A deep, reverberating pulse shook the walls, and the artifacts flickered brighter, as if reacting to their presence. The Aorc raised his weapon, stepping forward instinctively. What did you do? The human barely heard him. He was staring at the throne, at the sigils now glowing with renewed energy. Then, slowly, the air before them shifted. A figure emerged, translucent at first, then solidifying into a towering presence clad in ornate armor. The spectral warrior's gaze settled on the human, his expression both solemn and resolute. You have awakened the last memory of the fallen. The adventurers instinctively drew their weapons, but the human held up a hand. He met the specter's gaze, his voice steady despite the unease tightening in his chest. Who are you? The ghostly figure studied him for a long moment. A guardian of what remains, he finally said. His voice echoed as if carried from another time. We fought. We bled. We were forsaken. His gaze darkened. And now you stand here, a son of the forgotten. Why? The human's grip on the better standard tightened. Because the war isn't over. The chamber pulsed again, the sigils flaring brightly. The spectral warrior's expression did not change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, recognition. You carry their blood, he said slowly. And their burden. He lifted a hand, gesturing toward the throne. Then claim it. The words sent a ripple of tension through the group. The elf's brow furrowed. What does he mean? The rogue scoffed. Oh, come on. This is a setup. You sit in that thing, next thing you know, you're possessed. But the human ignored them. He took a step forward, then another, until he stood before the throne once more. His heart pounded. Everything in him told him that this was the moment he had, unknowingly been searching for since the day he left the dungeon. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the stone armrest once more. The air crackled. Then, suddenly, the world around him blurred. He was no longer in the ruins. He was standing in the same chamber, but alive. Banners flew high, torches burned bright, and warriors clad in full battle regalia filled the hall. He turned, his breath catching. The throne was occupied. A king, his face obscured by the shadows of memory, stared at him. You are the last, the voice boomed. But you are not alone. Then the vision shattered. The human stumbled, gasping as the ruins returned to focus. The spectral warrior was gone. The sigils had dimmed. But something had changed. The throne was no longer empty. Resting upon it was a weapon, a blade forged in an age before the Dominion. Its steel gleamed, untouched by time. The human stepped forward, reaching for it. The moment his fingers curled around the hilt, he felt it. A surge of power, of history, of something far greater than himself. He turned back to the others, his eyes alight with something new. The cleric was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. What happens now? The human lifted the blade. We finish what they started. The Aorc grinned, gripping his axe. Now that's something I can get behind. The elf nodded, determination settling over her. Even the rogue smirked, shaking his head. We're all going to die, but fine. Let's do this. The human turned toward the exit, the beta standing in one hand, the ancient blade in the other. The ruins had given up their ghosts. The past had revealed its truth. Now, the future belonged to the living. And humanity was ready to rise again.